People tell me I'm the difficult one, the stubborn one, the one who never learned to let things go. My daughter used to say I had a chip on my shoulder the size of a redwood. Maybe she was right. I spent 31 years as a county sheriff in rural Montana, and when you do that long enough, you stop apologizing for how you read people. You just know. So when my younger brother called me from a hospital bed in Phoenix last November, I knew before he even finished the first sentence that something was very wrong. Not medical wrong, people wrong. His name is Conrad, 62 years old, same as me. We're twins. Irish twins, they used to call us. Born 11 months apart, though most people who meet us think we came out of the same womb at the same time. We look that much alike. Same gray at the temples, same jaw, same way of standing with our arms crossed when we're thinking. The difference is Conrad got the patience. He became an architect, built a small firm in Scottsdale, did well for himself. Married a woman named Helen who passed from ovarian cancer 8 years ago. Has one daughter, my niece Becca, who married a man named Griffin about 4 years ago. Griffin. I'll get to. Conrad said he'd had a fall. Said he'd tripped on the back patio and fractured 2 ribs and bruised his hip. Said it was nothing, that he was being discharged in a day or 2. That he just wanted me to know. His voice was flat in a way I hadn't heard since Helen's funeral. No ups, no downs, just a man reading something off a card. Conrad, I said, who's in the room with you right now? A pause, then nobody. Then tell me what actually happened. Another pause. Longer this time. And then my 62-year-old brother, a man who once talked a drunk with a hunting rifle off a bridge with me standing 20 feet away, started crying. Quietly. The kind of crying a man does when he's been doing it alone for a while and forgot how to stop. He hadn't fallen. Griffin had shoved him. They'd argued about the house. Conrad's house, the one he'd built with his own money in 2004, the one he'd shared with Helen, the one Becca and Griffin had moved into 18 months ago after Griffin's construction business went sideways, and they needed somewhere to land. Conrad had tried to say something about the liquor budget, about the cases of bourbon Griffin was charging to the household account, and Griffin had shoved him into the patio door frame, ribs first. This wasn't the first time. I drove straight to Phoenix. 12 hours. I didn't tell Conrad I was coming because I knew he'd tell me not to. I also didn't tell Becca because I needed to see the situation before anyone had time to arrange it. What I found when I got there was my brother living like a guest in his own home. He was sleeping in the small bedroom off the kitchen. His own master suite had somehow become Griffin's home office and bar area. The refrigerator had a combination lock on the outside, not a padlock, one of those little number dials, which somehow made it worse, like someone had thought carefully about how to do it. Conrad's blood pressure medication was kept in a locked cabinet in the master bedroom. Griffin controlled the combination. If Conrad wanted his medication, the ones his cardiologist had him on after a minor heart episode 2 years ago, he had to ask Griffin. Let that sit for a second. A man in his 60s, in his own home, asking his son-in-law for permission to take his own heart medication. I sat with Conrad that first night after Griffin and Becca went out to dinner. He'd lost about 20 pounds since I'd last seen him at Christmas. He kept apologizing. For the house. For the situation. For bothering me. I had to tell him 3 times to stop apologizing. Does Becca know he put the lock on the fridge? I asked. She says it's to keep the grocery budget on track, he said. She believes him. She always believes him. I asked him about the finances. Conrad had a revocable living trust, set up after Helen died, with Becca as successor trustee. A smart estate planning move at the time. What he hadn't anticipated was Griffin convincing Becca to request early co-trustee status 18 months ago, right around when they moved in, citing Conrad's heart episode as a reason he might need support managing things. Conrad, still grieving and a little foggy from medication adjustments, had signed the paperwork without fully understanding what he'd agreed to. His own attorney had flagged it afterward, but by then it was done. They didn't have full control, but they had enough access to make Conrad's financial life complicated and slow, enough to delay transfers, enough to question every withdrawal, enough to make a 62-year-old man feel like a child asking for his allowance. I called my attorney that night from a gas station parking lot. Then I called an elder law specialist in Scottsdale whose name my attorney gave me. I didn't sleep much. Here's what I decided. I wasn't going to confront Griffin directly. Not yet. That would just make Conrad's life harder the moment I left. What I needed was evidence, time, and the right legal footing. And I needed to understand exactly what I was dealing with. So I stayed. I told Conrad I wanted to spend a couple of weeks. Catch up. He looked at me like I was offering him a life raft and wasn't sure he was allowed to grab it. Griffin, when he came home and found me installed in the living room with a cup of coffee and a pleasant expression, was visibly irritated but couldn't say much without looking like what he was. Griffin was 41. Broad. Tan the way men get tan when they spend a lot of time on golf courses. He had a way of filling a doorway that I recognized. It's a dominance posture, and I'd seen it in holding rooms for 3 decades. He shook my hand too hard and smiled too wide and called me sir in a way that meant the opposite of respect. He also, I noticed, kept glancing at Conrad while we talked, checking. The way you check a dog you're not sure is going to behave. I started keeping notes, dates, times, specific incidents. The morning Griffin accidentally let Conrad's medication run a full day past empty because he couldn't get to the pharmacy. The evening he turned off the internet router when Conrad was in the middle of a video call with his old business partner. The casual comments at dinner about how Conrad was getting confused lately and maybe should think about his options going forward. Each one small enough to dismiss. Together they formed a picture I knew very well. I also started talking to Becca. This is the part people get wrong about these situations. They assume the child who's enabling the abuse is simply evil or stupid or doesn't care. Becca wasn't any of those things. She was a woman who'd been slowly convinced over 4 years that her husband's version of reality was the accurate one, that her father was fragile and forgetful and needed managing, that her job was to support her husband, who was under enormous stress from his failed business, that any conflict was her father's fault for being difficult. I didn't go at her directly. I just started spending time with her, asking about her life before Griffin, reminding her, gently, of things she used to know about herself. She'd been a graphic designer, talented, had her own clients. She'd given all of it up when they moved in with Conrad. Griffin didn't think it was worth the disruption to the household schedule. Meanwhile, the elder law attorney was moving. We had enough documentation to file for a review of the co-trustee arrangement. Separately, I'd connected Conrad with a private financial advisor who was helping us build a clear picture of what had actually moved through the accounts in 18 months. The numbers were not good. Not criminal yet, or not provably so, not yet, but they told a story. The medication situation was the one that kept me up at night. I spoke to Conrad's cardiologist directly, identified myself, explained what was happening. She was alarmed. She prescribed a 90-day mail-order supply directly to a P.O. box I set up for Conrad, paid for with a prepaid card I bought in cash, and we quietly transferred the medications without Griffin knowing. Conrad cried again when I handed him the bottles. A grown man crying over beta blockers and a blood thinner because someone had finally given them back to him. Griffin started noticing that Conrad seemed less anxious, less asking. He couldn't figure out why. He came to me one evening while Conrad was in bed and sat across the kitchen table from me with the beer, and what he probably thought was a disarming smile. "He'd tell you we've been having some trouble getting on the same page?" he asked. "He mentioned a few things," I said. "He forgets," Griffin said. "It's hard to watch, honestly. We're just trying to keep things stable." I looked at him. Just looked. The way I used to look at people who had a story and knew I knew it wasn't true and were waiting to see if I'd push. "I'm sure that's hard," I said. He didn't like that answer. Too flat. No validation. He finished his beer and went upstairs. The attorney called 2 days later. The court had scheduled a hearing on the co-trustee review. We had 30 days. In those 30 days, a few things happened. First, the financial review came back. Over 18 months, approximately $43,000 had moved through the household account in ways that were, the financial advisor's word, inconsistent with documented household expenses. golf club membership fees, a boat repair, a series of cash withdrawals the weekend of a bachelor party in Las Vegas. None of it criminal on its face if you squint. All of it clearly documented now. Second, Becca found her old client portfolio on an external hard drive. I hadn't suggested she look for it. She found it herself, going through boxes she hadn't opened since the move. She sat at the kitchen table for 2 hours looking at it. I made us both coffee and didn't say anything. Sometimes the right move is to not say anything. Third, Griffin came home one afternoon and found Conrad and me in the living room with Conrad's original estate attorney, going over paperwork. Griffin stood in the doorway for a moment. That same doorway posture. But something was different in his face this time. The calculation was off. He'd always been the one who controlled what information moved through this house, and suddenly there was information moving that he hadn't authorized. "What's this?" he asked. "Estate planning," Conrad said, calm, straightforward. It was the first time in a week I'd heard him answer Griffin without hedging. Griffin looked at me. I smiled at him. I meant it to be pleasant. He went upstairs without another word. That evening I heard him on the phone in the master suite. The walls in Conrad's house are not thick. I couldn't make out every word, but I heard the tone and I heard the name of a specific attorney Griffin had apparently called before because he said it's him again, and then said something about moving faster. I called our attorney that night and told him to be ready. The court date was a Thursday. Griffin had retained counsel, a civil litigation attorney from a firm in Scottsdale I'd never heard of, but our elder law attorney had. She said they were aggressive and expensive. I said, good, let them be expensive. Conrad wore his good jacket, the one Helen had bought him for their 25th anniversary. He sat straight. He'd put on 4 pounds since I'd arrived, because he was eating regularly and his medication was right, and he was sleeping properly for the first time in months. He looked like my brother again. Becca came too. Griffin had assumed she wouldn't, or assumed she'd sit with him. She sat with Conrad. I watched Griffin's attorney clock that from across the room, watched Griffin clock it too. And I saw him understand, in real time, that the floor had shifted. The hearing itself was not dramatic in the way court scenes are dramatic in movies. It was paperwork and testimony and a judge asking careful questions. But the financial documentation was specific and thorough. Conrad's cardiologist had submitted a written statement. His original estate attorney testified about Conrad's mental state at the time of the co-trustee signing and the circumstances that had surrounded it. The financial advisor walked through the $43,000 line by line. Griffin's attorney argued that everything was above board, that Conrad had been fully informed, that this was a family disagreement being weaponized by a jealous sibling. He actually said jealous sibling. I wrote it down in my notepad because I wanted to remember it. The judge removed Griffin as co-trustee that afternoon. Full stop. She also referred the matter to the county attorney's office to review the financial irregularities. That part wasn't guaranteed, I want to be honest about that, but it happened because the documentation was clean and the pattern was clear. We walked out of the courthouse into a November afternoon that was, by Phoenix standards, almost cool. Conrad stood on the courthouse steps and put his hand over his eyes to block the sun, and just breathed for a minute. I stood next to him. "You drove 12 hours, he said. "Road trip," I said. He laughed. It was the first time I'd heard him laugh in 2 weeks. Becca stood a few feet away with her arms wrapped around herself. She'd barely spoken all day. I walked over to her, and she looked up at me with the specific expression of someone who has just seen something they cannot unsee and doesn't know what to do with it yet. "He's going to be very angry," she said. "Yes," I said, "he is." "I didn't know it was this bad," she said. I knew that wasn't entirely true. But I also knew that in certain situations, people don't let themselves know things until they're ready to know them. And she was ready now. That was what mattered. "You know now," I said. "What you do with it is up to you." She filed for divorce 3 weeks later. Her first call was to one of her old graphic design clients. Apparently, the client had never found anyone she liked as much and hired her back on a contract basis within the week. Griffin moved out of Conrad's house 2 days after the court hearing. Technically, he had to, under the terms of the order, which restricted his access to the property pending the financial review. He did not go quietly. There was a specific incident with the television set that I will not describe in detail, except to say that Conrad's living room wall needed patching, and Griffin's damage deposit would not cover it. The county attorney's office opened a formal review in January. I'm not going to overstate what that means. Investigations take time, and outcomes are never certain, and I've been in law enforcement long enough to be honest about that. But the file is open and the documentation is in it, and that matters. Conrad called me on a Tuesday in February, early morning. The kind of time he used to call when we were kids, and something had happened that he couldn't wait to tell me. He'd gone to a sunrise architecture walk in downtown Scottsdale, a thing the local AIA chapter does. He'd never let himself go before, because the schedule didn't suit Griffin. He'd run into a woman there, a landscape architect named Patricia, and they'd had coffee after, and he was calling to tell me about it in that slightly embarrassed way that men our age call each other when something like that happens. I sat on my back porch in Montana and drank my coffee and listened to my brother sound like himself again. People tell me I'm the difficult one, the one who doesn't let things go. They're right, I don't. And sometimes that is exactly the point. I keep thinking about that refrigerator with a combination lock on it. Such a small thing in a way. A piece of plastic and a 4-digit code. But that's how it usually works. The cruelty isn't one big dramatic moment. It's a lock on the fridge. It's a medication kept in someone else's cabinet. It's a man sleeping in the back bedroom of his own house, apologizing for existing. Conrad didn't lose his dignity all at once. It got taken from him slowly, in pieces small enough that each one seemed almost explainable. That's what I want people to understand when they hear this story. Griffin wasn't a cartoon villain. He was patient, he was calculated, and he understood, the way people like that always understand, that if you move slowly enough, the person you're targeting will start to believe they deserve it. I've spent a long time thinking about what makes a person capable of doing what Griffin did. And I think it comes down to an absence of something I'd call basic decency, a willingness to look at another human being and actually see them. Conrad was not a problem to be managed. He was a man, a father, a person who built something with his hands and his mind over 60-plus years. Griffin looked at all of that and saw a leverage. What stopped him wasn't luck. It was documentation, patience, and the willingness to do the unglamorous work. Phone calls, paperwork, a financial advisor going through 18 months of account statements line by line. People want justice to look like a confrontation in a doorway. Sometimes it looks like a court filing in a spreadsheet. I'll take either one. I think about Becca, too. She's the part of this story I don't fully know how to talk about, because she was both a person who made choices I don't entirely excuse, and a person who was also being manipulated. What I do know is that the moment she sat down with that old hard drive and looked at her own work, her own talent, her own history before Griffin, something shifted. You can't give someone that moment. They have to find it themselves, but you can create the conditions where finding it becomes possible. That's what I was trying to do. The one thing I'd tell anyone in a situation like this, clarity is a resource. Gather it carefully. When someone is controlling information, controlling access, controlling the story, the answer is not a louder argument. It's better evidence. It's the right attorney. It's the cardiologist's written statement. It's 90 days of blood pressure medication delivered to a P.O. box and handed back to your brother in a gas station parking lot. Conrad called me last week. He's going back to that sunrise architecture walk. He sounds like the person I grew up with. The person who talked me off ledges and bailed me out of 2 very specific situations I will not describe here. He sounds like my brother. That's what I drove 12 hours for. That's what the paperwork was for. That's what all of it was for. Some things in life require you to be stubborn, to not let go, to show up without being asked and stay longer than is comfortable and do the quiet, unimpressive work until the floor shifts. I'm glad I'm that kind of person. I used to think it was a flaw.